right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Keen On, and your mind is not playing tricks on you. I am David Masciotra, guest host today. You may recognize me as a past guest of the program, but on my most recent appearance, when Andrew and I were discussing the results of the presidential election in the United States, I, toward the end of the program, said, we should turn the tables and I should interview you because you wrote in your book, Cult of the Amateur, a series of predictions, all of which unfortunately have come true. So that's precisely what we're doing today. I'm going to put on my Andrew Keen costume and ask some challenging and I hope interesting questions. So Andrew, thank you for appearing as a guest on your own program today.
Well, thank you so much, David. I have to correct one thing, though. You're very kind about Cult of the Amateur. It got some things wrong, but it got a lot. It got some things. That was a Freudian error. It got some things right, but it also got quite a lot of things wrong. I'm not claiming that I could see the future. I think I poo-pooed Google's acquisition of YouTube for $1.5 billion, which at the time seemed an absurd amount of money. Now, YouTube on its own is probably worth close to $1 trillion. So it certainly wasn't entirely accurate in terms of forecasting the future.
That's correct. And it would be an interesting program if I say good things about your book and then you respond with bad things. But yeah, you're certainly correct. I'm talking big picture. I think that in the broad scheme of things, as the title itself would suggest, Cult of the Amateur, how today's internet is killing our culture. You threw a few bullseyes, and I want to begin with, you write in the book, early on in the book, that amateur hour has arrived and the audience is now running the show. And you make clever use of this old familiar allegory about a monkey using a typewriter, and if enough monkeys and enough typewriters met, eventually one would produce Shakespeare. Well, you say that these monkeys now have access to all kinds of typewriters, and instead what we have is narcissism and vulgarity and the death of expertise. So let's take a few of those topics. Let's start with narcissism. Of course, Christopher Lasch wrote a book in 1979, The Culture of Narcissism. Is this panic that we're seeing in the United States surrounding the election of Donald Trump, the much forecasted demise of liberal democracy, and increasing social division, in some ways a result of the narcissism that the internet has enabled?
Yeah, it's a good question. Coming back to your comment on the monkeys, I seem to remember that quite recently someone actually did a research project on that. I don't know if they actually put the typewriters in the hands of monkeys, but they concluded that however long you gave a group of monkeys typewriter, or I guess these days a computer and a keyboard, they wouldn't come up with the works of Shakespeare, even, trillions of years. So I'm always a bit wary of researchers, David, as you know, but so maybe even that experiment doesn't work. In terms of narcissism, it's a good question and an interesting question. Lasch wrote about narcissism, 40 years ago now, probably more. I always think these conditions are themselves mirrors. I'm always a bit wary of scientists or researchers discovering something new as if we didn't know it before. I think that a condition like narcissism is very much bound up in our times, although, of course, the concept of narcissism we inherited from the Greeks, from the mythology of Narcissus, the god of, I guess, of self-love. I had a woman on my show, a therapist, who wrote a book about our condition of narcissism. And talked about the way in which these dominant characters abuse us. She came up with all this different language of gaslighting. It was interesting. I read another piece recently suggesting that the progressive left, and I would certainly include yourself in that, and perhaps myself as well, although I'm perhaps a little bit more ambivalent about that group than you are, have the wrong language to win over the American electorate. So the language of narcissism, with its sort of consequential semi-scientific terms like gaslighting and the rest of the lexicon, is certainly both a cause and a consequence of our age. There's a kind of Arendtian, I think, element here too, in the sense, or maybe a Tocquevillian element, that the more we weaken our intermediary institutions, the churches, the schools, the local assemblies, particularly self-government, the more we retreat into ourselves, and the more isolated we are, the lonelier we are, and the more likely we are to be subjected to narcissistic personalities, and perhaps be narcissists ourselves. Trump is both a cause and a consequence. I mean, he's a classic model. He's exhibit A of a narcissistic personality. Guys like him always existed. There are always guys like him with bullying fathers and an obsession with achieving something, and an insecurity and a bullying nature. But it seems as if the 2020s are a time where these kinds of personalities prosper.
Well, you make very interesting use throughout the Cult of the Amateur of the term democratize, that this idea that the internet would democratize our culture, our institutions, our media, was bandied about by the techno boosters as almost salvific. And here you come with your heresy saying that if we democratize everything, we'll actually weaken democracy and suffocate culture. So I wonder, would you make a distinction between cultural democracy, which we now seem to have in abundance, and political democracy, which is now in some ways under threat? Are they at odds, even though they're both forms of democracy?
Well, I think what I was trying to say, maybe I wasn't as concrete as I should have been, is there are different kinds of democracy which got hashed out in the early years of the American Republic, particularly in the Federalist Papers. After the Americans threw the British out, they debated what kind of democracy they wanted. Did they want a representative democracy, a democracy supported by, of course, Madison most of all, and in some ways Jefferson and Hamilton, certainly Hamilton more than Jefferson. Jefferson was sort of stuck between the two worlds. And then those people who perhaps you might think of more on the left, although they might have also been on the right, who believed in a direct democracy. And so what I was trying to say in Cult of the Amateur is that this is not a new argument. You can have elites in politics or in culture and still maintain an accessible democratic system. So you need gatekeepers, if anything, to actually maintain democracy. In the Cult of the Amateur, I haven't read it for many years, so please remind me if I'm wrong. I know you had the misfortune of having to read it for this show, which was very generous of you. I talk about the value of gatekeepers, of their role in actually providing access. So I know you're a big fan of Bruce Springsteen. You're very familiar with a lot of the history of American culture. You remember, of course, the figure in the music business who discovered Bruce Springsteen. Who was it, David?
John Hammond.
Right, and I write about John Hammond. John Hammond not only discovered Springsteen, but Dylan and a number of other remarkable artists.
Rita Franklin.
Yeah, Aretha. I mean, it's just an incredible array of artists. So in a sense, I guess Hammond is an elite because everyone had to go through him. He saw many, many acts. He decided who had value and who didn't. Maybe some slipped through the net with him. Maybe there's an undiscovered Aretha Franklin or Dylan or Springsteen out there who didn't get discovered by Hammond. Maybe he had a bad night or a couple too many drinks or something. But basically, the value of gatekeepers is they maintain democracy. So that I think is what the founders of the American Republic, or the Federalists at least, understood. And I think Madison summed that up best. So the argument in Cult of the Amateur, as I said, maybe I didn't make it perhaps as clearly as I should have, was an argument in favor of representative democracy and against direct democracy. And of course, I was writing in 2007. That's 10 years before the catastrophe of plebiscitary democracy in the UK that created Brexit and the increasingly plebiscitary nature of Western democracies. So I think that there's I don't know if it's an irony, maybe it's more of a paradox at the heart of democracy or democratic theory, is you need elites, you need gatekeepers to maintain it.
Yes, you have a line in the book in which you say that oh no, it's actually in another book of yours, The Internet is Not the Answer.
Wow, you've done some serious reading, David.
You write that.
I hope you're not being expected to be paid for this interview.
I'm vying to become the world's first Andrew Keene scholar.
And the first and last, David,
but you're right that you would wear the term elitist as a badge of honor if elitist is to mean supportive of gatekeepers and supportive of the standards that they represent and enforce. If I could push back on that just for a moment, because I know there's people who are listening to this, and if Noam Chomsky was listening,
I'm sure he is, guaranteed, Chomsky. I know it's essential listening for him.
He would say, it was decades ago that Edward Herman and I wrote the book Manufacturing Consent. He and others would say the gatekeepers have caused us a lot of problems. Look at the 1980s, for one example. The gatekeepers didn't push back much on the so-called Reagan Revolution that undercut the social safety net in the United States. The gatekeepers got the HIV/AIDS story wrong, with a great deal of homophobic reporting and panic over kissing and sharing drinks. The gatekeepers in the early 2000s got the run-up to the Iraq War so long that the New York Times and the Post had to publish apologies on their front pages. Not many gatekeepers warned of the subprime mortgage crisis that created the financial collapse. So are you looking at the gatekeepers through rose-colored glasses?
I probably am. I mean, I have to admit that I've never been particularly convinced with Chomsky's. I mean, I'm sure he's a good philosopher of language, but I think his political ideas are rather childish. I've never quite understood his currency. You mentioned a few of those, and I agree in some and not in others. So I agree with you on the Iraq War, and I agree with you about the Great Recession of the late 2000s, and both those show the weaknesses of the establishment or the elites in the US in particular. I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think those elites, particularly when it came to the wars, the post 9/11 wars, reflected a particularly arrogant and irresponsible elite. But let's use the other example. You mentioned the AIDS epidemic. Let's imagine that Chomsky had his way. Let's imagine that you had the AIDS epidemic and you didn't have a scientific establishment. You had everybody weighing in, articulating their vision. We had a nation of RFK Juniors. I guarantee you that the hysteria would have been way more acute. I mean, sure, scientists aren't perfect. They're capable of error. Nobody knew what the AIDS epidemic was. It took a while to figure it out. And then, of course, they came up with a cure for AIDS, which at the time seemed inconceivable. The same was true of COVID. So I would agree in part, but I think that reflects the crisis of the American elites. But when it comes to science in particular, I would disagree. I think when you put when you put decisions in the hands, I use this word carefully without trying to get into trouble, of the monkeys, then you would have utter hysteria. Imagine if we hadn't had any Anthony Fauci's in 2020. I mean, that's what Trump seemed to want. He seemed to think that he knew more. I mean, Trump is the quintessential monkey. So imagine if we didn't have a Fauci saying, well, you might need to wear masks, I'm not entirely sure, and this can be passed on, and we're not entirely clear. And we had rabble-rousers, plebiscitary rabble-rousers, Roman emperors or wannabe Roman emperors like Trump, saying, oh, blaming it on immigrants or their pets or the Chinese or some other sort of insanity, then things would have been significantly worse. So I wouldn't say you're entirely wrong, David, but I do think that Chomsky argument is childish and has never been proved. There are no examples in history of direct democracy effectively working for long periods. I can't think of any. You always need elites who mediate between the people and the law, now, particularly in politics, but also probably in culture.
Well, for the record, I share your point of view. I was playing devil's advocate. I can't have anyone walking away from this video confusing me with a populist.
Well, don't you? Do you agree with me on Chomsky? I mean, I've never understood why he's such a big deal. When it comes to politics, I can't comment on his linguistic philosophy.
So I've interviewed Chomsky twice, and I was a big admirer of his during my undergraduate years, and then for a period of time in my 20s. And I think that he appeals to someone who is progressive minded, but a bit immature, because Chomsky presents a Manichaean worldview in that, the U.S. is always on the side of injustice, or U.S. elites at least are always committing injustices, and the noble masses, if they had a better media and better democratic representation, would right all of the wrongs in our society.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that the American, especially when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, the record of American elites is pretty poor, from Vietnam to the post 9/11 wars, even to the current situation, both in Ukraine and Israel, Gaza. So I'm certainly not defending the elites universally, that they're quite capable. But at the same time, I think it's also worth noting here that when you don't have elites, it's not clear who's responsible for mistakes. At least when it came to Vietnam, we could blame LBJ and McNamara. I've done some shows on that. They were the so-called smartest guys in the room who turned out to be the dumbest guys in the room. When you have direct democracy, who do you blame? The people? And then what do you do? Cancel the people?
Well, we should certainly look at elites with nuance and ambivalence, as you're suggesting. But one thing that's happened that the cult of the amateur predicted, whether you want to claim a crystal ball or not, is the undermining of expertise and the loss of faith in expertise. That's in science. We saw a good bit of that during the COVID years. It also is in journalism. So Pew Research recently released a study indicating that about 20% of Americans now routinely obtain their news and commentary from TikTok. For Americans under the age of 30, that number jumps to 40%. So rather than the proverbial Woodward and Bernstein, you're listening to some influencer such as Joe Rogan bloviate about a topic he knows very little.
I mean, in defense of TikTok, I'm not sure how active Rogan is on TikTok.
No, he's not. I'm talking about more broadly that what we have happening in our society now is, well, I'll frame it in a question instead of ranting about it. do you agree that one of the problems facing our society, and to a lesser extent other Western societies, is an increasing cynicism towards experts and an increasing gullibility towards so-called influencers like Rogan?
Yeah, I think I may have in some ways changed my mind since the book. So much has happened since. I mean, I think you have to distinguish Rogan from the people on TikTok. And I think you also have to define or redefine what you mean by news. I mean, what do you mean by news? What's going on in the world? I mean, people, I'm not sure people go on to TikTok and think to themselves, well, I need to know what's happening now in the American election or in the Ukrainian war or what's happening in Gaza. So I'm going to check out TikTok.
Well, I think that if we could just narrow it to younger Americans, college students around that age, none of them by their own admission, none is too strong, but very few by their own admission look at newspapers, look at more traditional sources of news and commentary. Instead, they obtain most of their information and insight or lack thereof from social media. So that's what I'm referring to. That major shift in consumption from the American voter, particularly those under the age of 30, maybe even under the age of 40.
So it's a skepticism, it's a lack of trust in the media, which of course, I'm doing my How to Fix Democracy series. It's going into its 6th or 7th year next year, and we're focusing on the crisis of trust. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, Cult of the Amateur was both a cause and a consequence of that crisis of trust. The Walter Cronkites of the world have been replaced by Joe Rogan. Cronkite, I just read a piece about him, or I read a piece about one of these heavyweights of the 20th century. They were always rather unpleasant people, much more manipulative and exploitative than they appeared on screen. But they were the ones who were trusted. And now we have it's a different kind of trust. I think with Rogan, I mean, I'm not an expert on Rogan, but I think people trust him in a different way. They don't trust him in what he says. I'm not sure if he actually ever really says anything, but they do trust him in his ability to ask the difficult questions or the impertinent questions or the obnoxious questions, which is why I was very disappointed that Harris decided, or the Harris team decided not to appear on the Rogan show. To me, it speaks of the archaic and rather pathetic nature of her campaign, that she or somebody in her campaign chose not to appear on Rogan. I don't have a problem with Rogan. I think that shock jock culture existed before the internet. The issue of news and trust is another issue. And the other thing, I mean, you mentioned Christopher Lasch. This culture of paranoia, obsession with conspiracy, has always been a feature of American culture. So the more I think about what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years with the internet, the more I begin to suspect that there are other forces as well, that we shouldn't just blame everything on technology. I mean, before the invention of the internet, you still had this, as Douglas Hofstadter has argued so wonderfully, you still have a culture of paranoia, of conspiracy. Sorry?
Richard Hofstadter.
Oh, sorry, Richard Hofstadter. Is there a Douglas Hofstadter? I don't know where the Douglas
probably somewhere.
Yeah, probably, maybe his son. But anyway, Richard Hofstadter so famously argued.
And Hofstadter
it's a question of scale, I guess. We use this term in Silicon Valley, scale. So back then, you could only sit around in a cafe or at your home and conspire or be anxious about a group of people who you thought were destroying the world. Now you could just go on TikTok or X and find it. But with Rogan, I mean, Rogan is really now old media, I think. I mean, he's replaced those elites. He's the new Walker. For better or worse, I'm not necessarily a big fan, although I'd like to have his audience. People trust him. I think the problem is what happens after Rogan. Especially with AI, when you don't even know who the people are behind this media. At least we know there is someone called Joe Rogan. We know where he's coming from. We know where he broadcasts from. We know his interests, his ideologies. So I'm less concerned perhaps with him in 2024 than I am with other forces.
So you made an interesting comment that referring to Hofstadter, that much of this is already—
Not Douglas, this was Richard, right?
Right, yes, Richard. That most of this is part of human nature.
Well, American human nature in particular. Hofstadter, of course, wrote famously about— what was the I forgot the essay title, David. I'm sure you remember it.
Well, he two classics, especially now, Paranoid Style in American Politics.
Yeah.
And Anti-Intellectualism in American Life.
Yeah, and he was, of course, part of that school. Daniel Bell, Christopher Lasch, all these people.
Yeah.
When you talk about my prescience, I was writing on their shoulders back in 2007. I wasn't always familiar with all their work, but I don't think I was saying anything different from what Lasch and Bell and Hofstadter were all warning about in the 50s and 60s.
Well, maybe it seems what you argued in The Cult of the Amateur, and you could correct it now if you've amended your view. But yes, paranoia is part of human nature, particularly in the US. Anti-intellectualism is a dominant strain of American culture. But you quote Marshall McLuhan at one point in the book, who most famously said the medium is the message. And McLuhan was interested in how, regardless of content, a technological communicative medium exerts an influence over a society. And I'm also reminded of the comic writer Fran Lebowitz, who said that people were naive enough, some people, to believe that if you gave everyone the internet, everyone would become Michelangelo. But she said instead, everyone's watching porn and playing video games because that's human nature. Most people aren't Michelangelo, regardless of the tool at their disposal. So is what the internet did is enhance people's base instincts, that with the absence of these elites and the gatekeepers, what happens is most people behave according to their nature. And we're learning that that's paranoid, anti-intellectual, and amateurish.
Yeah, I think what the internet did was, the original title of Cult of the Amateur, which actually was a title that I inadvertently stole from Nicholas Carr. It was the title of one of the chapters in the book. And the publisher said, "Oh, you need to call it Cult of the Amateur." And I said, "Well, that's not my term. That's Nick Carr's." And they said, "Well, you can have it, and you better write to Nick." And he was never very happy. He's remained a friend now. The original title of Cult of the Amateur was The Great Seduction. And that was, or is still, the great, that's the truth about the internet. It's a seduction that suggests that what we say is interesting and important. Now, as humans, I guess we all think what we think and say is interesting and important. And maybe if we don't, we have other conditions which are equally worrying. But the problem is it gave the illusion or the delusion that we can count, that we make a difference, that what we think and say will change the world, and that other people would be interested in what we think and say. But actually, the consequence of the internet is the reverse. There was another book out at the same time as Cult of the Amateur, and it was the opposite. This was called, it was by a guy called Chris Anderson, who at the time I think was the editor of Wired magazine, and it was called The Long Tail, that suggested that what everyone said was important and interesting, that we could all, if not become artists, we all had something interesting to say. And what he called the long tail was this cottage economy that could exist in this new world where everyone became an author, everyone was a publisher, everyone was a musician and a filmmaker on networks like, Blogosphere and YouTube. But actually, the irony is that there were two things happened. Firstly, everyone thought they were being listened to, but no one was listening to most people. The vast majority of people were talking to themselves. They were just screaming into a void. But the reality was that this new economy destroyed a creative middle class and created a winner-take-all economy. So it created the Joe Rogans with their tens, hundreds of millions of followers. It created an internet underground, a sort of a dark internet where people rant and rave about the most bizarre things, about other peoples of other skins and religions and sexualities and genders. And everything else was decimated. And we all think we have something interesting to say, but we have, again, in Arendtian terms, the conditions of totalitarianism. I'm not saying that totalitarianism now exists, where the intermediary institutions, particularly in cultural terms, were destroyed. Now, we still have, fortunately, publishers. We still have some newspapers, but over the last 20 years, almost since I began researching and writing Cult of the Amateur, much media has been decimated. Local newspapers, for example, have been pretty much destroyed. Even large regional newspapers like the LA Times and the San Francisco papers are in crisis. The publishing industry has been boiled down to the dominant four. The same is true of the music industry, has been completely decimated. But we have huge stars, huge creative media stars, the Taylor Swifts of the world. It's a winner-take-all cultural economy. A lot of people predicted this in research terms. I think I was one of the first people to actually intuitively grasp it. It's the reverse of the long tail. Someone need to write a book. I don't know what the words would be on the long tail. It's the short front, perhaps. But all it is a winner-take-all economy, which is bad for culture. It's bad for democracy, and it's also bad for ourselves, because I think most people really know that no one listens to what they say and no one cares what they think. Partly because there's just too many voices out there, and partly because the vast majority of people have nothing interesting to say. I know that's a rather elitist thing. I'll probably get thrown off the internet. I've already been thrown off the internet lots of times, so I'm not worried about that. But most people have no. I run a show. I've done several thousand episodes, and even supposedly educated educated authors with books, they don't have it. Mostly they don't have anything interesting to say. So how do people who haven't written books have anything interesting to say? So in that sense, I guess I am a rather ugly elitist. Although I have to, in terms of that word elitist, I always use it slightly ironically. After Cult of the Amateur came out, I was invited on the Colbert Show when the Colbert Show was good. And at one point, Colbert, in his mocking way, pointed over the table in a joking way and said, "You, sir, you're an elitist." And I sat back in my own sort of idiotically arrogant way and said, "Yeah, what's wrong with that?" And ever since then, I've been sort of described as an elitist, which is probably true.
Well, but you're speaking to an irony in that the internet promised to create more democracy, and yet it failed. We have a winner-take-all economy, and now we have tech oligarchs increasingly powerful and influential over our government. Elon
Yeah,
Musk,
I mean, and they're not just oligarchs. These are some of the richest people in the history of the world. I know, we're thinking of the Thiels and the Bezoses and the Musk. These people are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Musk is likely to become the world's first trillionaire.
But on to your self-declared elitism, which I suppose I share. There's this we also live with this idea that I suppose goes all the way back to Rousseau. You're talking about the cult of the amateur. I would say the cult of authenticity. That some barely literate yokel in the middle of nowhere in Kansas somehow possesses the political sagacity that Madison and Jefferson, and in contemporary terms, Robert Putnam, lack. And therefore, we're all living within this cult of the amateur and cult of authenticity, because there's a cacophony, as you suggest, and in that cacophony, it's very difficult for people who actually have something to say to be heard.
Yeah, I'm thrilled you picked on Rousseau. I don't like him either, and I think a lot of the troubles of our age can be traced back to Rousseau and his cult of authenticity. I mean, Rousseau argued famously, I think, most of all in Emile and in all his work, that the less you know, the more you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the noble savage.
Yeah, which of course is satirized perhaps best in an odd kind of way in Huxley's Brave New World. And talk about hysteria and conspiracy theory. I mean, Rousseau would have loved the internet. He would have been felt totally at home. He had all sorts of theories. He was the Donald Trump of the age. No one took, I mean, he was a very talented guy, but no one took him seriously in Paris. I think Voltaire or the others dissed him, which made him angrier and angrier. I mean, he was a remarkably talented man and a wonderful writer. I mean, whether you like his ideas or not, he articulated them in a brilliantly compelling way. But I agree. I think another of the dangers is the book could have easily been called, rather than The Cult of the Amateur, The Cult of Authenticity. That's why I'm always, if there are certain words people use, and if they use them seriously, then I dismiss them automatically. So authenticity is a word. I always associate that word with Arianna Huffington, another mogul who became a mogul using the language of democracy with her Huffington Post. I think now she's schmoozing with Sam Altman at OpenAI. We have to be really very careful about idealizing lack of knowledge and suggesting that that there's something noble about not knowing.
Well, Bill Clinton just a few days ago said politics is the only enterprise where you prove authenticity by not knowing anything.
Yeah, although he's not an example of that. I mean, he was a remarkably talented politician,
Oh,
a Rhodes Scholar and a policy expert.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he means what it's become, what it is now.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's taken it to an extreme form where his brand is based on boasting about not knowing anything. He wouldn't even pretend he knows anything. I mean, Reagan, I think, created a kind of art, but it was in some ways an attractive art. He certainly knew more than he appeared to know, because he didn't appear to know anything, and he ran a relatively tight ship. But on the other hand, David, I mean, you're right on all this, but then of course our elites have turned people off. The other extreme is the Pete Buttigieg model of the Harvard PhD who spends 10 years at McKinsey and then brings their wisdom to hand it down to the masses. And that's as much of a turnoff, I think, as Rousseau's cult of the noble savage.
Well, you framed it as the dictatorship of experts versus the dictatorship of idiots. And I suppose
and we of course need to navigate between I can't pronounce the Greek meaning. What is it? Scylla and Charybdis of those two. I mean, that's the challenge for all of us to navigate our societies between those two extremes, which are both ludicrous and dangerous.
Well, to that point, most of the solutions you delineate in the cult of the amateur are no longer actionable. Because
and you're being very polite. I mean, the solution section was terrible even at the time. I mean, and the only reason I put it in because the publisher requires, I'm sure you've done books, and they always say, well, you got to finish with some solutions, and I had no solutions. And the solutions I come up with, I haven't read them for many years. I don't think I even read it when it came out, but
it was
they
kind
were
of
particularly bad in that book, I think.
Well, to that point, then, what's our future? Is it some cyberpunk dystopia? Does any of this get better? Is there a way out? Is there a way to resurrect trust in verified expertise and gatekeepers who protect culture and advance democracy in the representative, genuine sense?
You always ask the important questions, David. You must be learning from a great interviewer.
I I've studied the Keen on tapes.
Yeah, I'm teasing you. Yeah, that's the all-important question. You mentioned McLuhan, of course, who understood this medium. I mean, he would have understood the internet. He died in 1980, but he would have I mean, he basically predicted, a lot of people predicted the internet. I always think Borges as well predicted the internet, but McLuhan predicted it before anyone. He would have been entirely unsurprised by any of this. It was interesting. One of McLuhan's most sophisticated interpreters these days is an old friend of mine, Douglas Rushkoff, a New York media theorist, much published, much loved guy. I was in New York this week and I interviewed him for the show. The interview will be coming out later this week. And he made a really interesting remark. And Rushkoff always understands the world. He's always a couple of steps ahead of everybody else. And he simplifies things. And he made it in a McLuhanite way. And this was his remark. What he said about AI, he said, because at the end, I asked him the same question that you asked me. He's as critical, if not more, of the winner-take-all economy, the multi-billionaires, the paranoia, the authoritarianism, all the rest of it in
degradation of culture.
Yeah, and he's more disappointed because he was a believer in the 90s, and so he went through the full sort of false seduction. He's the rejected lover, or he's the disappointed lover. But he made a really interesting remark, which I'm still trying to process, but I think in its own way is very profound. I said to him he needs to write a book about it before other people steal it. I've already stolen it. At some point, I'll probably conveniently forget that he used the term first, just like Cult of the Amateur was
you have to write
Nick Carr's term, and now it's mine. But he said about AI is that AI is the first native internet app. And I'm not entirely sure what he meant by it, and maybe he isn't entirely sure, but I think he's onto something there. And I think just as now everybody has written off the internet, now the zeitgeist has shifted so dramatically and everyone thinks big media is a catastrophe. I actually think that there's something in this idea of AI, of the internet finally having something in the form of AI where some of its promise when it comes to decentralization and democracy can be realized. So I'm not entirely sure how it's going to work out. I'm not going to make a fool of myself and guarantee that AI will save the world or save democracy or culture or ourselves. But I have a feeling that things are going to start to get a little better. I'm no longer quite as pessimistic about our culture as our politics as I was in 2007. I was unusually pessimistic in 2007. I was very much against the grain. I was one of the few people who were pessimistic about the internet and of the digital revolution. And now I'm a little bit more optimistic, and perhaps I'm in a minority now. But I think there's a lot of things that can go right. There's obviously a lot of things that can go wrong. You mentioned Musk, Thiel, and Bezos. I'm no bigger fan of them than you or Doug Rushkoff. But this idea of some sort of collective wisdom, which the internet was supposed to be, although of course it took the form of Google and what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. I hope that we as humans can learn from our mistakes. I think Winston Churchill, I hate quoting Churchill, but I've got sucked into it here. Churchill famously said, I can't remember the exact quote about Americans, but he always said something about America. Is America it always does the right thing after choosing to do the wrong thing several times.
Yeah, after exhausting all the other options.
Yeah, or something like that. And I think that may be true. I think we've hopefully learned a lot from the last 30 or 40 years and all this failed promise in a way, winner-take-all economy. And I think people are also tired of hysteria. I think if social media was suddenly taken away, was banned or eliminated, I don't think that many people would actually care anymore. They're sick of it. Well, I mean, you'd have the Rogans, of course, the lunatics, but most people don't care about them.
Well, one thing that I've observed with my students, I teach undergraduate students, is about 10 years ago, they were all eager to defend social media. Now, even though they're all still hooked on it, they recognize that it's awful. but they're just like an addict who can't put down the bottle or the syringe. So in a way, that's progress.
Yeah, that's progress. And it's also worth noting, and this was something I did predict, I didn't write the book about it, there was a couple of very successful books, is that what we've seen over the last 40 years is the reappearance of analog and the value of analog. It got manifested certainly in the craze for vinyl, which has saved the music business. It destroyed CDs, but it saved the CD industry, but it's now the most lucrative side of the music business. The book business has always survived. People still buy books. Bookstores still do well. Some people still buy physical newspapers, but many people subscribe to newspapers online. I subscribe to too many. I spend half my money on that. So I think there is a value. I mean, I guess that's not really the cult of the analog, but I do think that young people appreciate more and more analog things. And I think most of all that's manifested in the physical experience. That's why COVID was such a traumatic experience, because it was kind of the internet on steroids. Suddenly the world became the internet. You couldn't go out, and we just relied on our computers to communicate. That's why so many people, most of us, in fact, kind of went crazy. Can't blame, of course, the internet for COVID. But I think we as humans, we want physical interaction. We enjoy talking to one another. We want to read physical books. We want to listen to vinyl. We want to go to the movie theater. And we want high quality stuff. We're not uncomfortable spending money on it. I mean, that was my point in Cult of the Amateur, and I think that's true. Is spending $10 on going to a movie can change your life. What's your favorite movie, David?
Favorite movie? There's so many. It's hard to name just
think
one.
Of one. I mean, or your top three.
Top three. Well, my favorite comedy is probably Groundhog Day. We talked about Big Lebowski, another comedy.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about Big Lebowski, because you and I talked about that.
Yeah.
I mean, at one point, you and I forked out whatever it was, probably $5 or $6 to go and see the Big Lebowski. That hadn't necessarily changed our lives. I mean, my life was changed by paying to go to see Hitchcock's Vertigo, but we don't view that money as a waste. It's probably the best, smartest investment of our lives. I mean, and we're all venture capitalists when it comes to culture, because we've also been to a lot of bad films that we've wasted money on. But it's the same with books, same with newspapers, same with music. I mean, we could do a whole show on albums that have changed your life. I mean, at one point I handed over $6 for Blood on the Tracks back in 1974. I mean, that's changed my life too. So I think we want value in culture, and currently the internet doesn't really provide, and I'm not sure AI does. I mean, AI may provide some other architecture for democracy and governance and wisdom, a collective kind of wisdom. But we still need our cultural industries. We still need to read. And I think the resilience of the book is the best example. I mean, in 2005, when I wrote Cult of the Amateur, a lot of people were just dismissing the book. They thought the future of the book would be the Kindle, and that everyone would read online and all bookstores would shut. And that hasn't been the case. So there's still hope. We need to we need to remain cheerful, David. That's what my message almost 20 years after Cult of the Amateur.
Well, on that note, I've certainly enjoyed this conversation and enjoyed reading your books. So let's remain cheerful and talk again.